Happy New Year! And may this year be better than the last one. Man. Our close to home Advent journey wraps up today, and I love that it extends past the end of Christmas and includes the wise men and the 12 days of Christmas. And I also encourage this, I was just talking about this before the service, I encourage this because there are so many friends and neighbors who are of the Orthodox faith and who celebrate on January 7th. And I'm all into bringing Christmas. This is a great holiday. Just let it extend, let it go on. So we are here still in the Christmas season and still within the 12 days of Christmas. So many times our seasonal studies just kind of leave us in the waiting time of Advent. But the story goes on, and so I'm glad we're continuing this week. Now, there's one thing in the Close to Home series, for those who've been following, it's been ongoing through the series, that at least I haven't mentioned yet. Maybe Dylan has, but I have not mentioned this yet in our series, in the sermons, and that is the Saturday pages. Did y'all notice them, Saturdays? Some of you going, yeah. Every Saturday, the Close to Home series recommended that we observe Sabbath in some way. And I want to tell you, folks, that observing Sabbath, practicing, trying, experimenting over the past few years has been such a blessing to me. I cannot recommend it highly enough. They suggested in their studies making a commitment to doing one of the following. And they said things like go for a walk, or sit quietly and meditate, or plant something, or spend time with a friend or loved one, or explore a new area of the city. A whole list of things that they give you that you might do on the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath. Just out of curiosity, how many of you actually tried one of these? Okay, I had a feeling. Plus, if you stuck your hand up, I'd say, what did you do? Tell us what, right? Anyway, I was not expecting to see a whole lot of hands on that, because Sabbath is, once you get out of the habit of Sabbath, it is very hard to reclaim it. It's something we've almost forgotten about in our culture. And it used to be, I'm showing my age now, but it used to be a long time ago that Sunday was everybody's day off. Nothing went on Sundays. But that changed about 50 years ago, I think. I'm going to get to the wise men. We are going to get to this theme. But before I leave the Close to Home series, I wanted to just talk about the Sabbath just briefly, because I believe that this really is very important for us today. I think keeping Sabbath may be one of the wisest and most practical things that they've given us in this series. Use what's there. Sabbath keeping is one of the 10 commandments. It's right up there with honoring your parents and not killing and not stealing and not lying. So if it's that serious to God, why do we think that this one commandment can be ignored? The thing is, when we keep the Sabbath, we begin to become, from the inside, the kind of people who wouldn't dream of breaking the other 9 commandments. We become people more in tune with God's way of seeing things. When God gave us the Sabbath, God knew we needed it. God knew we needed rest, relaxation, a time for pure enjoyment of God's creation. God knew if we deprived ourselves of these things, we would end up with a skewed view of the world and our place in it, which is the first step in the direction of injustice and violence. Now, as Christians, we don't necessarily observe Sabbath the same way the Jewish people would, but I think we can learn and get some ideas from what they do. In Judaism, Sabbath is observed for 24 hours every week, from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. Sabbath begins Friday night with lighting candles and praying a prayer that begins out, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe," and then goes on to say why God is blessed, and then goes on to ask God's blessing on each member of the family at the dinner table. And those of you who have seen the old movie Fiddler on the Roof, you've seen what a Sabbath meal looks like. It was on yesterday. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. It is traditionally the best meal of the week, made with the finest ingredients. And then after this, the family has time to spend together, catching up with each other, playing games together, playing music if they choose to. And there are long, long lists of things that Jewish believers cannot do on the Sabbath. And as a Christian, I don't get tangled up in this stuff. But I do sometimes use them as guidelines. For example, one of the Jewish rules says that you may not carry anything across the threshold of the house on the Sabbath. This is meant to prevent people doing work on the Sabbath. And I personally interpret it as things like don't go grocery shopping on the Sabbath, which by the way, I find it helpful not to shop at all on the Sabbath, just kind of stay away from money transactions. Don't do any major landscaping that would require heavy lifting. Leave the trash cans where they are for another day, that kind of thing. And another rule says, again, from the Jewish point of view, says, don't turn anything on or off during the Sabbath. And for Jewish people who observe this strictly, that includes TVs, cell phones, computers. Personally, I can't go that far. But I do say no work may be done on the computer on the Sabbath or on the cell phone. You get the idea. So these become things that we use for enjoyment rather than work. Now, all of this may sound strange, and I admit it is different, but I can also tell you it is a deep joy. And why should Sabbath feel strange if God commands it? Jewish theology tells us that the Sabbath is meant to be a foretaste of heaven, a hint of what our eternal rest will be like. And is there anything more important in this life than preparing for eternity? So I cannot recommend Sabbath keeping strongly enough. It is a blessing that shouldn't be missed. And if you get a chance, like I said, in the handouts that you'll have, the little booklets, take a look at the Sabbath suggestions, try them out. If 24 hours is too much, start with 8. Try out something with that and give it a shot. So having said all that, our theme for today is Home by Another Way, focusing on the wise men. And Isaiah predicted that the wise men would come in the passage that we read just a few moments ago. Isaiah predicted that nations would come to your light, that is, to Israel's light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. And a few verses later, Isaiah says, they shall bring gold and frankincense and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. This prophecy, written hundreds of years before Jesus' birth, is fulfilled in the actions of these kings from the east. So who were these wise men? Were they really kings? What did they know? How did they learn about Jesus? What is all this? So out of all the gospel writers, Matthew is the only one who mentions the wise men. Matthew doesn't say anything about 3. The number 3 is guessed at by the number of gifts given. And Matthew also doesn't say anything about kings. The idea of royalty comes from the Isaiah passage. Most likely, the wise men were leaders in their society, and there probably was a group of them, probably more than 3. And most likely, they were from their country's priestly caste rather than from their royal caste. They were specialists in astrology and in other works that today we might call magic. And what's so cool about this is that even though we are warned against magic in the scriptures, what's cool about this is that God reached out to them in a way that they could understand. They knew astrology, so God gave them a message in the stars. God met them where they were and brought them to where God was. And that's exactly what God does for each of us. Something else we know about the wise men is that they did not arrive at the manger on the same night as the shepherds. Now, it doesn't mean we have to put away all our nativity sets, okay? But anyway, the wise men saw the star when Jesus was born, and they would have talked about it and planned the trip and traveled on camelback for roughly around 1,000 miles. So this probably took months, possibly years. It's believed that Mary and Joseph stayed in Bethlehem after Jesus was born until the time that he was presented in the temple, which makes a lot of sense because a journey from Bethlehem to Nazareth back to Bethlehem, that was a long journey, and you wouldn't do that with someone who's just given birth. So it makes sense that they would have stayed in Bethlehem for a little while. And it also tells us in Scripture that when the wise men arrived, they found Mary and Jesus in a house, which also makes sense because people who had been there for the census would have left by that point, and there would now be places to stay. When the wise men came to Herod, King Herod, Herod questioned them closely about when the star appeared. Now, Herod was famous in the ancient world for being paranoid and brutal. He had even had some of his own children killed because he was afraid they were going to take his throne. So when Herod inquired about when the star appeared and when and where exactly the Messiah was to be born, it was not with the purpose of worshiping Jesus. So when the wise men followed God's instructions to go home by another way, Herod, in his paranoia and fury, ordered all the male babies in the Bethlehem region, 2 years old and under, to be killed. Can you imagine being a mother in those times? Can you imagine even just being one of Herod's soldiers and having to carry out that order? Matthew only mentions the children very briefly, but they have been remembered by the church ever since. They have a saint day. It's December 28th, so we just passed it a few days ago. It's called the Day of the Holy Innocents, and they are considered to be the first Christian martyrs. So Jesus may have been as old as 2 when the wise men arrived. And he survived because God warned Joseph to take his family to Egypt until after Herod died, which wasn't that far after, by the way. They didn't have to stay there long. Before we leave this scene, let me point out a contrast between the people who should have been welcoming the Messiah and the foreigners who actually welcomed him. God's people, Herod, the scribes, the Pharisees, should have been thrilled to hear that the Messiah was finally here in their lifetime. I mean, they've been waiting for hundreds and hundreds of years for this promise to be fulfilled. But at that moment, instead, they focused on fear and oppression and murder. Meanwhile, the people who had never read the Old Testament, who knew little about the God of Israel, came to see Jesus with an attitude of acceptance and justice and worship. And Jesus' whole life would be like this. He would be loved by foreigners, Samaritans, Syrophoenicians, and he would be killed by the leaders of his own people. So about the gifts the wise men brought. First off, I found it interesting that the Greek Bible mentions the wise men having huge treasure chests containing all kinds of gifts fit for both a king and a god. And these chests in Greek are called thesauri. Same word we get thesaurus from. It's like a treasure of words, right? Treasure chest. This is huge thesauri they had. And out of the thesauri, the wise men presented to Jesus gold for a king, incense representing prayer, which we see incense in the Bible. Incense like rises heavenwards, and so it represents prayer. And myrrh, which is a lovely perfume that was often used in embalming or at funerals. So those were the 3 gifts. And having presented these gifts to Jesus, and having greeted Mary and Joseph, and having shared their story of their journey, the wise men headed home. But having been warned in a dream, they did not go back to Jerusalem or to Herod. They went home by another way, by another road. Now, I was curious about this. Since I've been to the Holy Land, I was like looking at the maps going, which way did they go? Google can't tell us. Google has no idea. So I can't tell you. I don't know which way it's made difficult because we got Bethlehem and you've got Jerusalem where the king is, and then you've got the Dead Sea. So how are you going to get around that heading that way? I don't know. What I do know is that it made the trip a bit more of a challenge. It meant that they had to go a bit further out of their way because they had to skirt Jerusalem somehow to get around the king. And today, as we are on our journeys, today it's a challenge sometimes just to get home, just to get to where we're going. In our world, it's easy to lose sight of which direction our heavenly home is in. So as far as heading home by another way, I would say, as we consider other paths, as we think about other roads, look at the following conditions. First off, that we know God is God. So as we're focusing on finding our way home, God is God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God and Father of Jesus. There is no other God, and Jesus is the only way. If God tells us to go another way, as he told the wise men were warned, if we receive heavenly direction, a clear and unmistakable message from God, then we need to follow it. And if God does give us a message like this, so if we have to travel a different road than the one we expected, this new road may add mileage, it may not make sense to us at the time, and it may be a matter of life and death to go that way. However, we do not want to go home by another way if God isn't directing it, or if we're not clear on God's direction, or if we're craving novelty, we're getting bored, want to try something new, or if the course change would lead us away from God or into disobedience to God. So the wisdom of the wise men is that they chose to obey God rather than human authority, which is something the early disciples also did in the book of Acts. The story of the wise men teaches us that Jesus is the true king. The wise men could have conspired with King Herod. They could have enriched themselves by betraying Jesus, but they knew Jesus was the greater king and deserved the greater loyalty. It was worth more to the wise men to know that the baby Jesus than to know the King Herod. Think about that. It's like being given a choice between going to dinner at the White House or presenting a gift to a poor woman's baby. Which one would we choose? The wisdom of the wise men is also found in that they studied together and traveled together and worshiped together and interpreted God's signs and dreams together. They moved together. They moved as one. They were of one heart and one mind. The Bible tells us that a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, and that was certainly true of the wise men. The wise men risked their lives to meet Jesus, and when they finally met Jesus, they were full of joy. They found what they were looking for. They found the one whose birth the stars announced. They were overjoyed with exceeding great joy, Matthew says. And the wise men, by their lives, challenge us to be willing to risk, to be willing to make this baby king more important than all the kings and rulers of this world. The wise men challenge us to put Jesus first in every way and over everything. So let's take this wisdom of them, that wisdom of theirs, into the new year. Amen.